classic that is used in a lot of different American culture, but is particularly dear to bluegrass musicians. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this map before. This is a cultural map of the United States. Bluegrass is usually considered a tradition of Greater Appalachia, starting in the Appalachian Mountains and moving west according to migration patterns. It has its roots in Celtic tradition with African American influence related to the blues. The two major differences between Celtic and bluegrass fiddle is that you bend pitch a lot more in bluegrass fiddle, and also the rhythms are more syncopated. Celtic fiddle tends to move straightforward fashion. This is a lovely image from the internet, and this is an 18th century banjo. So banjo is an African, originally, it's an American version of an African instrument called the kora. This is my grandma, Grandma Marie. She won a competition at the State Fair of Kansas when she was 18 years old to record a record. And she did that, she made a record. And then for the rest of her life, she and my grandpa made music together, either in churches or in friends' homes, in theaters once in a while. And then when they were in their 60s and retired, they turned their garage into a country music theater. I'm sure you can imagine how, as a teenager, I personally was not impressed by this. I did a lot of soul searching when I was writing this paper, putting this project together about what it is about American culture or like rock culture that makes country seem so uncool. And I think part of it is that in rock music, there's really a tradition that musicians are supposed to be self-destructive, and like ideally they would die young. And then my grandma is sort of the opposite of this, that she just kept making music her whole life. So they had this theater in their 2,000 person little town, and they would have jam sessions, they would have just like people from the next tiny town or like somebody touring through, and it was the great joy of her life, absolutely. This is the Carter family, who I know was a big inspiration to my grandma. They were sort of the beginnings of what's considered bluegrass music. And if you notice the date, 1927, we usually think of bluegrass as being a very, very traditional form of music. But actually, it sort of started to coalesce around the invention of the radio, because before that, every village had their own style. Like if you're up in the mountains of West Virginia, it's very isolated, it's difficult to get from village to village. But the radio consolidated the style, and this woman, Ma Bell, she invented the sort of iconic country music guitar that you hear all the time in country music. And it's interesting because you usually think of that as being a man thing, but actually it was invented by a woman and sort of copied ever since. This is the Grand Ole Opry. So it started as a radio show, as you can see, it's 1925. And then once television was invented, it became a television show. And this is a problem in any sort of traditional music, that you sort of get stuck in that moment where that music was invented or like codified. So they had very strict, and they still have very strict dress codes that you have to dress like country style. Even though maybe it's not representative of how musicians would dress or behave in their day-to-day life. So this moment of late 20s is when things sort of crystallized in that way. This is Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. So Bill Monroe is usually credited as having invented the term bluegrass, referring to Kentucky bluegrass, which is an actual kind of grass. Funny story about him that I saw in one of the documentaries I watched preparing for this. So he was apparently really awful to work with. That's him. He was so awful to work with that people would quit his band all the time. They would quit after like 2 weeks or like a month. And then but he was so famous that they would put it on their resume that they were one of the Bluegrass Boys. So that's kind of how this term got propagated, was just like this stream of refugees from his band. So I guess it pays to be a jerk sometimes. This is a more modern instance. Yo-Yo Ma has released a couple of albums with Chris Steele, who's a very famous bluegrass mandolin player. I think this is a really interesting thing to look at culturally, and in terms of like when we have discussions about cultural sharing versus cultural appropriation. Definitely, Yo-Yo Ma has given a lot of statements about how deeply he respects this music and how he felt really drawn to it. It is interesting to think, though, that like you can sort of move easily down the power hierarchy, right? Like he can show up and be like, I want to learn bluegrass, and then have access to like the best bluegrass mandolin player in the world, right? But if Chris Steele had shown up at Carnegie Hall and been like, I want to be in a symphony, right? Not so likely. And that, you know, there are those levels of power dynamics. So, I mean, definitely this was a great collaboration and very beautiful, but it's always important to think about power hierarchies in when you think about culture. Michael Cleveland and the Flamekeeper. Michael Cleveland is absolutely amazing. The fiddle player in the middle. I watched a lot of him getting ready, mostly so I could feel bad about myself, because he's absolutely fantastic. But when you see him in interviews, it's this really interesting contrast between the slowness of the speech and the fastness of the fiddle. This is a very Appalachian cultural feature, right? Like conversation is slow and very polite. Like you really weigh your words and you take time to like watch the other person's reaction. But the music is fast and upbeat. This is a video I found. We don't have video of my grandmother and grandfather performing. We tried to get some toward the end of his life, and I think his general attitude was that he knew we were trying to find a way to miss him less and he wasn't going to play along with it. But this is a very beautiful video of someone very similar that I stumbled across and was moved by.
What, just start talking now?
Yeah, just start talking now.
All right. I guess you want to know something about my fiddling. I started quite a few years ago, probably when I was 8 or 10 years old, the best I remember. And during that time, I quit playing the fiddle for around 20 years, and then started back in the 70s. Been playing in several contests across the country. Won some and lost some, as usual. But I've enjoyed my fiddling, still do. I may not fiddle too good, but I can fiddle real loud. Yeah. Well, we have a lot of fun anyway. We may not make much money, but we may have a lot of fun. I enjoy playing, yes. I'm getting up in years. I'm past 91 years old, looking for 92. Started in the ministry preaching the gospel when I was 29 years old. Still preaching the gospel. In fact, that's my life, is preaching the gospel. And I have seen the results of preaching the gospel, which that blesses me to know that you've helped someone along the way. And we're going to play a good old hymn. It's called Amazing Grace. And I think we'll play that in G. We'll try to sing a verse of it. Get together here.
Stay on this side of Dad. Don't take it out.
It's amazing.